Okay, all right, so we're going to get started. So today we are going to be talking about the trout life cycle and habitat. And for this presentation, for anyone joining us, we will have the chat open when we have open-ended questions. So I will let you know when we are going to open that chat. So for now, it's going to be closed off. Let me just make sure it's closed. All right, cool. And then also, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A. That's going to be open. So any additional questions we'll try to get to at the end. But to start off, welcome. So this is our second lesson for trout in the classroom. And today, like I said, we're going to be talking about the trout life cycle and habitat. And some of the things we will be needing to learn today, and what you should know by the end of this lesson, is knowing what a habitat is and also what trout need in their habitat, to know the stages of a trout life cycle, and also to know what a life cycle is. And before we go any further, I also just realized I forgot to introduce myself. So my name is Caitlin. I'm an AmeriCorps educator with Nevada Department of Wildlife, and with me is Jessica Castle. She is our wildlife education coordinator for the Western region, and also Jan Nemec, who is our angler education coordinator. And they're all here today to talk about trout in the classroom and kind of help me out moderate any of the questions, and they will be answering questions as well. All right, so let's get started on what we're going to learn about today. So now we know kind of what we're going to learn about. So let's get started by what is a habitat? So I'll open up the chat to anyone who wants to answer that question. What is a habitat? You can give examples, you can say what a habitat needs, you can just kind of give an idea of what the definition is if you have anything to contribute. All right, so our habitat has 4 things that every habitat needs. So first thing that a habitat needs is going to be food. So food can really be anything that an animal needs. So it can be plants or it can be other animals. And that's going to be super important to make sure that any animal in this habitat gets the energy it needs. Then we also have water, so there should be a source of water for our animal. So water can come from rivers and lakes, runoff, anything like that. Also, our animal's going to need shelter in their habitat. So shelter will provide protection from other animals. It also will protect them from the elements. So if we have some pretty aggressive weather, then they will be able to protect themselves from any kind of harm from that. And also they will need space. So space is going to be super important for their territory, for making sure they have space to move around, and also for when they need to lay their eggs or if they have young or anything like that. They want to make sure they have plenty of space to do that. So what does our trout habitat look like? We already know that we have our tanks in the classrooms or on the live stream, wherever you might be watching it. And we're going to kind of see what the habitat looks like in the wild and see how our needs are met with the tank that we might have in our classroom as well. So there's several factors that are needed in order to have an ideal trout habitat. So this might be what you would see if you put a camera down on the bottom of the river floor, or if you were swimming in the river and you had goggles on, you could see this underneath the water surface. So we can see a couple things right off the bat here that our trout are going to need. So one thing is the space. So they got lots of space for territory. There might be areas to go around. It looks like there's not a whole lot of other fish in this area. So let's just say we're looking through the eyes of a single fish right now. So this is plenty of space for a single fish to use. The other thing that they might use is the places to hide from predators. So the shelter, you've got some good rockiness right here next to the shore of the river. And then also under these plants and sticks and whatever other debris might be in the river too. Then we've got good flowing water to catch insects as they float downstream. So that flowing water is super important to help them to travel and also to bring food to them and also oxygen, everything like that. So they are going to be eating insects, some of our macroinvertebrates, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. They also need cold water. So between roughly 45 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit with lots of oxygen. So that's where those bubbles are super important, and they need that for their development and also to have enough oxygen in the water. And lastly, they're going to need good sized gravel for their eggs. So when they put their eggs down, they're going to want some good sized gravel, which can provide protection and also keep all the eggs anchored into one spot. So that is super important for them to have. So like we said, we've got our food, our water, obviously, because they're in the water, shelter, and our space. So those are our 4 things that we need for every habitat. So there's a couple of habitats up here too, and I want you to figure out which one would be suitable for our trout. So I'll open up the chat again if anyone wants to contribute. So we've got A, this is one of our habitat options, and then B, and then C. So which one might be the best for our trout? Anyone want to guess? All right, so some people might say C because it does look like pretty clean and flowing water, but actually it's not going to be deep enough for our fish. They need plenty of space. As you can see, it's not really a well-connected river. It looks more like a stream or a very, very shallow creek. So they're gonna need a little bit better in terms of space and shelter. So that's not really a good option. B is way too murky, it's not enough oxygen, it's probably too warm. And also probably not going to have the right food for them. So we're not going to do B. So the correct one would be A. We got a really, pretty good sized river, it's flowing water. You can see that there's lots of rocks, good places to hide, probably lots of gravel for them to put their eggs down. And also probably lots of different insects that will visit this river and be good food for our trout. So flowing cold water with lots of oxygen and lots of space. All right. And so what is a life cycle? Can anyone answer that for me in the chat if they are wanting to contribute to? All right, so a life cycle has 4 important things that we'll go over real quick. So a cycle is something that happens over and over again. So any kind of cycle you can think of just in your life. For example, if you wake up in the morning, you have a routine. So you might wake up, shower, brush your teeth, eat breakfast, go to school, do your homework, come home, eat dinner, and then it starts all over again the next day. So that's kind of a cycle of the way things are going. Or there might be a process, something that continues over and over again. So that is a cycle. And then a life cycle is going to be a series of changes in an organism's life. And an organism that we say here is one individual living thing. So, a plant is an organism, we are organisms, dogs and cats are organisms. So just a single living individual is an organism. And life cycle will be the accumulation or the complete, cycle of everything that happens in their life. So every stage that they go through. Also, one thing that is super important in every life cycle is reproduction happens. So this is important to continue the cycle of life, to continue, passing on those genetics and those genes, to continue life. So to make sure that a new life is created out of, one life cycle. So our trout are going to create new lives when they lay eggs. And then every living thing will have a life cycle. So every living thing, no matter what it is, goes through some sort of change in their life. Nothing stays the same consistently. So whether it be growth, like in size, or just changing in the way they look, or something like that, is going to be a part of their life cycle. So what are some examples of life cycles? If you have any examples, you can feel free to put them in the chat, or you can put them in the Q&A. And what do you think happens in a fish life cycle? So some examples that a lot of times we like to use is also like our butterfly metamorphosis. That's a really good example of a life cycle. So we've got our big caterpillar. They'll eat a bunch when they're born just to get, fatten up and get bigger. Then they will go through metamorphosis. So they will go into a pupa or a chrysalis. And then during that time, they will undergo massive change and they will come out with wings and they will be a butterfly and they will lay their eggs again and the cycle continues. So that's a good example of a life cycle. And then in a fish life cycle, I'm sure you can assume that something similar happens. You know, you're born, kind of get bigger, and so on. So we'll go over that one by one. So with the fish life cycle, we're going to start as eggs. Very simplistically, we'll go to the Alvin stage and we'll talk a little bit more about these stages as we go on, but this is just an overview. Then we go to the fry stage, and next is the juvenile stage. And then finally, they reach the adult stage, which is also the spawning stage. And during the spawning stage, they will spawn some eggs, which will start the cycle over again. And then this adult will usually go on to be predated or die. It's very rare that our fish will ever die from old age, but usually they're predated, which means that they're eaten by another animal. And so that kind of brings us back to what trout spawning is. So you're probably wondering, what is spawning and why do we keep talking about this? So spawning is the release of eggs by a female trout. So these are going to be our eggs. So she will go and find a really suitable area with lots of lots of gravel and a good place on the riverbed to lay her eggs. She'll put these orange eggs down, and then a male trout will swim over the eggs and fertilize them. So all our eggs are our cells. And these fertilization will also be other cells given by the male. So when they combine, they can create fertilization, which happens, and then creates fertilized eggs. So now we have what starts the growth of our baby trout. And our trout have a natural instinct to swim upstream to spawn. So an instinct, what is that? An instinct is going to be something that naturally motivates us. So we have an instinct that we know we need to eat. Even when we're babies, we'll get hungry, we'll cry out for food. So we know that we have to eat something. We know that we want milk. That's kind of the instinct that these trout have. They know that they need to go upstream. So that's exactly what they do. They go upstream and then they spawn these eggs. And then these eggs get fertilized and they start to grow. And with our eggs, it's really important that they have a suitable habitat to be able to survive and then hatch. So this is super important that we make sure that the eggs in our tank or just in the wild have enough to survive and hatch successfully. So a healthy egg will have these 4 different things. So they'll need lots of oxygen in the water. This is to make sure that they develop properly. They're going to need that river gravel, which is what we call a red. And a red is going to be an area where they have that good sized gravel that they can anchor onto and also stay protected on the river so that they don't float away or go too far. Also protects them from predators, that they can be safe from predators. That's the 3rd thing. And then also that they have good water temperature, which is also super important for their development. And this is kind of what a river gravel red would look like. So, you know, you can get those rocks on the bottom of the river. That's what they would look like. All right. So it looks like we have 2 questions. So I'll answer those right now. How deep should the river be for trout to live? That's a good question. So you just want to make sure that they have enough to be able to swim back upstream. Sometimes the river can get really shallow and small. But it should be enough that it's continuous and that they can swim without having interrupted areas. So if the river is way too dry and there's not enough space for them to swim back upstream, that's going to be a big problem for them. And how much time does the life cycle of a trout last? So trout can live about 3 to 5 years in the wild, I believe. It just kind of depends on how far they get with their predation. So sometimes they might get eaten or, they might, something might happen to them before they can even reach a certain stage. But ideally, our trout will live about 3 to 5 years. All right. And also one thing that is important to remember is that not all of our eggs will get fertilized. So some eggs will just kind of be hanging out and never develop, but they'll become food for something else. So to start off, let's say we have about 1,500 trout eggs. So remember this number and think about how many do you think will make it back to their spawning territories as adults as we go through. So we have 1,500 eggs to start. And like I said, these are just eggs, they're not fertilized yet. So some of them might die off or whatever happens. We'll go through each stage and we'll kind of figure out how many trout would typically survive that stage. So the first one is Alvin. So once our trout hatch, they are known as Alvin, which is the hatchling stage, and they're fresh out of their eggs. Their egg sac yolk is still going to be attached to their body, and they're going to feed on this for nutrition. So if you have a tank, you might notice that right around today or tomorrow, that a lot of the eggs might be hatching, especially if you live in the northern region where we just delivered a lot of those eggs. And those are going to be kind of these very small, wispy boys right here. They're or not boys, but wispy trout. So they will be very small. They'll have that little egg sac attached to them, and they will be using that for nutrition until they're big enough to eat whatever is in their environment. And only about 30% of our eggs might become alvin in the wild, so to survive and hatch. And in hatcheries, that survival is going to be a lot higher. So you have to think that they don't have that natural predation. Then we have our fry. So during this stage, alvin have developed enough to feed on the small insects in the water. And they're also going to be hiding in dark areas of the river, and they're going to start becoming a little bit more territorial. And this is super important that they have that space in their habitat to have like those aquatic plants and large stones that are important habitat for them. And this is what our fry will look like. So you notice that they have those fingerling marks, which are the black marks that go down them. And as they get older, they will lose those marks. So this is going to be, for example, a rainbow trout fry. And a little over half of our alvin will grow into becoming fry. So they're really small and defenseless. So it is really hard to get to the fry stage. Not many survive to this stage. And the fry stage also results in really high mortality. So only about 5% of our fry will actually survive the fry stage and go on to become juveniles. So it's a very, very small percentage. So when we get to the juvenile stage, they've grown in size compared to their fry stage, and they're also a little bit more recognizable. They start to get their markings a little bit more, and their territories at this point are going to be pretty established, and they start to move downstream. So by this point in time, they know a little bit more about the world around them. They're able to better escape predators. They're creating their territories. They're doing pretty good. They're growing up. They're learning things. And this is about the size of our juvenile. So this is not a rainbow trout. This is, I think, a brown trout or something. But these guys are a little bit bigger than our fry. And like I said, they're starting to get normal markings and everything like that. And juveniles are going to be better at hiding, but they're still less than half of juveniles actually end up becoming adults. And then finally, we've reached our adult stage. So by now, our trout are going to be full size, and they'll be defending their own territories and eating plenty of aquatic insects, preparing to swim upstream to spawn, successfully evading predators. So they've been doing this for a minute now. So they know how to survive. And this is going to be our full size rainbow trout. And even though they're more aware of the dangers, they'll still get predated or fished. And like I said, that's kind of what they look like at the full size. They got that pinkish coloration on the side of them. They got the pink cheeks. So they're going to be at a good level to be able to go back up and spawn. Okay. So life is rough for our trout, as we can see. So less than 5% of trout will survive their first year, and very few complete their life cycle. So you can say that of our 1,500 eggs that we had at the beginning, maybe 20 or 30 will return to their spawning territory, or even less than that. So that's how we get some of our fish. They're going to head back upstream to spawn, and then start the life cycle over again. And so what is life like for our hatchery trout? So our hatchery trout obviously will go through the same life cycle. They will go through all the same stages, but they do have a couple different challenges that they have to deal with. So survival is going to be a little different. So we actually do have a hatchery down in Mason Valley in Yerington, and the hatchery will have trout growing from the eggs, where they are protected from predators and given plenty of food. So they don't really have to worry about a lot of their numbers being decimated by predators or being swept downstream, or just, natural disasters or anything like that, anything crazy. So they're pretty well protected, and about 95% of our alvin will survive to adulthood here. And the trout are going to be released into our rivers and lakes as adults. So by the time they're adults, they will be released. So they are what we call stocked into different rivers or lakes around the area. And the hatchery trout definitely face a lot of different challenges. So one thing is that the trout tanks are going to be very crowded. So fish are on top of each other. They're going to be rubbing next to each other often, which rubs off that slime layer that they have, which makes them a little bit more susceptible to diseases. And also just overcrowding makes it hard to, I guess, just have that space that they need. And they also will survive for a month or less once being released. So unlike our wild trout, who have been learning to survive in their environment, they've been doing a really good job of, I guess, kind of learning the hard way what is good and what's bad for them to do in terms of like what food they need and where they need to go to hide. These trout don't know any better. So once they are released, they're almost immediately predated or fished because they don't really know any better. And they won't move very far once they're released. So you can assume that they will move less than probably a mile from where they were, or even less than half a mile from where they're released. So if you are a fisher or you're, an angler, it would be good to probably figure out where exactly they were released at. And then if you go within that area, you'll be able to find a lot of them. So these hatchery trout are going to be very, they don't move around a whole lot, so they're going to be fine with not really moving that much in the wild either. So, and today we learned quite a bit, so we kind of wrap up everything. Before we kind of go over that, I'll answer any additional questions. Actually, it looks like we already answered all of them. But we learned about the habitats of trout and the 4 things that every habitat needs. We also learned about the stages of the trout life cycle. So what stage means what, and I guess how many of our trout survive those stages, and I guess what they can expect. Also survival of trout throughout their life, and the differences between our hatchery trout and our wild trout. So those are definitely some really important things to remember going forward, because we'll be talking about, fishing and also the predators and what they eat and lots of different things in future lessons. So this is a really important first lesson to understand, I guess, what our trout need to survive, and also to know what exactly their habitat's going to consist of. All right. So thank you so much for coming today. All right. Let's see, are there any other questions? We have a question, do trout eat each other? Absolutely. So some trout will eat other smaller trout of different species, or, they'll eat the eggs, especially if there's no food. So it's definitely a possibility. It's kind of like, there's always a bigger fish type of situation. The bigger fish are going to eat the smaller fish. But definitely trout will eat trout of different species, or even just like smaller Alvin, or, if they're adults or something like that. So. All right. Okay, doesn't look like we have, hold on. Which gender is bigger, male or female? Pretty sure the male are bigger. Is that correct, Jan? Do you know? All right, I'm pretty sure the male are bigger, but it just does depending on species, because they have some differences. So for example, jaws can be different. So maybe the jaw size in a female is smaller than the jaw size in a male, or just the way it kind of opens, or just, different things about them. Have people ever found trout fossils? Absolutely. So we have had different fossils found for some different fish species in the area. And this is definitely the way that we can preserve trout fossils, and also different fish are pretty easy to preserve, because if they fall, if they die and they fall into a mud layer and it's pushed down pretty hard by like thick mud or anything like that, it's very easy to preserve those specimens, or any of the tissue or bones or anything like that. So we do tend to have a lot of like aquatic fossils. So absolutely. How do trout clean their eyes? That's a good question. So they actually have that mucus layer, so they don't really need to like clean their eyes necessarily. They kind of have like a pretty thick layer on there that protects them from any kind of like parasites or anything that kind of would bother them or get in their eyes or anything like that. All right. So I think we're all good. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And if you have any additional questions about today's lesson, feel free to email. My email is going to be endowed2.americorps@gmail.com. And also feel free to email Jan or Jessica if you have any questions as well regarding this lesson. Let's see. And yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming, everyone.